several down.
All right, hey, I'm making entry, all right?
I'm right behind you.
Go.
Go.
All right.
Hey, we got some down.
Hey, two down.
Say that, police. If you're in here, anybody come out.
Police! We got a third down in the lane.
Some crimes are loud, others happen quietly, so quietly that no one notices until it's too late. Behind the closed doors of an ordinary home, a teenager lived a life defined by silence. No voice to cry out, no strength to escape, just days that blurred into nights, and suffering that became routine. To the outside world, nothing seemed wrong. There was a mother, there was a home, there was an explanation for everything. But explanations don't leave marks on wrists. They don't empty a child's body of food, and they don't turn a basement into a place of punishment. What began as a call reporting an unconscious child quickly unraveled into something far more disturbing. Investigators were confronted with scenes that could not be justified, stories that could not align, and a truth that refused to stay buried. This was not an accident, not a moment of bad judgment, not a misunderstanding. It was prolonged cruelty hiding behind excuses, neglect disguised as care, and a child who paid the ultimate price for it. As the investigation unfolded, every statement cracked under pressure. Every detail pointed to a reality so disturbing that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend it. This is a story about silence, about responsibility ignored, and about how the people meant to protect a child became the reason he didn't survive. What you're about to hear is not easy, but it is necessary, because some truths must be told, even when they are painful to face. On the morning of February 6, 2024, a call came into emergency dispatch from a quiet residential street. The caller was a mother. Her voice was controlled but strained. She said her 16-year-old son was unconscious. By the time first responders arrived at the home, it was already too late. The teenager was pronounced dead at the scene. At first glance, the house didn't look like the site of a violent crime. It wasn't ransacked. There were no broken doors or shattered windows. Nothing suggested an intruder. What officers encountered instead was something far more unsettling, a death that didn't look sudden, but prolonged. The boy was found in the basement laundry room, not in a bedroom. Not on a couch, but on a narrow cot, elevated by storage bins, in a cramped space surrounded by concrete walls, cleaning chemicals and household clutter. According to officers, it appeared he had been lying there for a long time. The teenager was identified as Jeremiah, a non-verbal autistic child who required constant care and supervision. He was completely dependent on the adults in his home to meet his most basic needs: food, hygiene, medication, safety. Those adults were his adoptive mother, Tamara, and her long-term boyfriend, William. From the very beginning, Tamara framed the situation as a medical tragedy. She told police that Jeremiah had suffered seizures the night before. She explained that he was prone to falling, becoming aggressive, and injuring himself during episodes. She claimed she had followed medical advice, kept him in a safe area, away from furniture, away from anything he could hit his head on. According to her, the basement laundry room was the safest place. She said the house was cold due to electrical issues. She said the basement held warmth. She said the cot was his favorite spot, and she said she was only trying to protect him. But almost immediately those explanations began to feel thin. Officers noted that Jeremiah's body showed signs that did not match a sudden medical emergency. His physical condition raised questions that could not be answered by seizures alone. The room itself raised even more. The laundry room door had a lock on the outside. The cot appeared restrained, and the overall condition of the space did not resemble a temporary recovery area. It resembled confinement. Tamara told investigators that earlier that day, around 11 a.m., she had checked on Jeremiah. She said she fed him soup, gave him something to drink, administered his medication, and let him rest. She claimed she returned later, around 4 p.m., and found him unresponsive. She said she attempted CPR. Then, after a delay, she called for help. That delay mattered, because phone records would later show she made numerous calls to family members during the window when she claimed everything was fine. And because someone else in the house, William, gave a version of events that only complicated things further. William said that Jeremiah had a habit of refusing to move or respond, that sometimes he would lie still, and they would leave him alone. He described behavior that minimized concern, suggesting this wasn't unusual. But investigators weren't just listening to words. They were observing patterns. They learned Jeremiah had not been attending school regularly. They learned he had been isolated. They learned the basement had become his primary space. And they learned that what was being described as care did not align with what they were seeing. During follow-up questioning, Tamara admitted Jeremiah was not fully toilet trained. She said he sometimes soiled himself during seizures. She explained that due to a lack of hot water, she cleaned him with baby wipes instead of bathing him. But the medical examiner would later reveal something critical. Jeremiah's digestive tract was completely empty. No food. Not from the night before. Not from that morning. Not from hours earlier. This wasn't missed meals. It was starvation. That single finding shifted the entire case, because starvation does not happen overnight. It requires time, neglect, and repeated failure to act. As investigators dug deeper, they found marks on Jeremiah's body, ligature marks on his wrists and neck, marks consistent with restraints. When shown photographs, Tamara claimed the marks were either self-inflicted or from past attempts to restrain him during seizures. She said she had stopped using restraints. She said they didn't work. But the physical evidence suggested otherwise. There were signs that Jeremiah had been restrained for extended periods, signs that his movement had been restricted, signs that he had not been cared for in a way consistent with medical guidance or basic humanity. When detectives pressed her, Tamara's story began to shift. She contradicted earlier statements. She distanced herself from responsibility. She placed blame on William, suggesting he may have locked Jeremiah in the room, even though she claimed she never personally saw it happen. But again, the lock was on the outside, the cot had restraints, and Jeremiah could not speak for himself. What investigators were uncovering was not confusion. It was a pattern of isolation, a pattern of neglect, a pattern of suffering hidden behind explanations. By the end of that first day, police were no longer investigating a medical death. They were investigating a homicide, and the people responsible were not strangers. They were the very adults Jeremiah depended on to survive. As investigators continued their work, the focus shifted away from the scene itself and toward the people who were supposed to explain it. Because the more officers listened, the clearer it became that the accounts they were being given did not align with each other, with timelines, or with reality. From the beginning, one thing stood out. Time. Not just the time of death, but the hours surrounding it. According to the mother, she had checked on her son late in the morning. Everything, she said, seemed fine. Yet phone records showed she spent much of the afternoon on long calls with relatives, calls that did not match the calm picture she initially described. Investigators compared her statements with digital data, timestamps, call logs, and phone activity. Slowly, a different timeline began to emerge, one where concern may have started far earlier than she admitted. And then there was William. He had been in the home. He had access to the basement, and he had his own version of events. At first, William minimized everything. He framed the situation as difficult but manageable. He spoke about behavior issues, about frustration, about moments when it felt easier to step away rather than intervene. But when pressed, his words shifted. He acknowledged that there were times the teen was left alone, times when doors were closed, times when intervention didn't happen. And while he tried to distance himself from direct responsibility, he could not explain why conditions in the basement were the way they were. More importantly, he could not explain why he didn't act. Investigators noticed something else as well. Neither adult showed urgency in the moments that mattered most. There was hesitation, delay, a lack of immediate response that stood in stark contrast to what would be expected in a genuine emergency. That gap between what should have happened and what actually did became impossible to ignore. As detectives continued their interviews, contradictions multiplied. Statements changed subtly at first, then more noticeably, then dramatically. Details about when the teen was last checked on shifted. Explanations about who was responsible for what became vague. Responsibility was passed back and forth, never fully claimed. It became clear that this was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about avoidance. Meanwhile, investigators expanded their scope beyond interviews. They examined household records, school communication, and medical history. They spoke to educators and caregivers who had interacted with the teen in the past. What they learned painted a troubling picture, not of a single moment gone wrong, but of a gradual withdrawal from oversight. School attendance had declined, support systems had weakened, and the child had become increasingly isolated. No one outside the home truly knew what was happening inside it. That isolation mattered, because when a vulnerable person disappears from view, when routines break and questions go unanswered, accountability disappears with them. As the investigation progressed, detectives reached a point where the explanations they were hearing could no longer reasonably account for the outcome. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. At that point, the investigation took a decisive turn. This was no longer about gathering information. It was about responsibility. On April 12, 2024, police made their first arrest. The mother was taken into custody at her home and charged in connection with her son's death. The charges reflected not just a failure to protect, but active participation in conditions that led to his death. Her arrest sent a clear message. Investigators believed this outcome was preventable, but the case did not stop there. William was nowhere to be found. As officers searched for him, they widened the net, contacting relatives, checking known locations, tracking movements. For days he remained out of reach, and his absence only deepened suspicion. When he was finally located and arrested, the case entered a new phase. 2 adults, 2 sets of charges, 1 undeniable outcome. From that point forward, the legal system moved quickly. Prosecutors reviewed evidence. Medical findings were finalized. Investigators prepared for what they believed would be a difficult and emotionally charged trial. But trials are not the only way cases end. As months passed, negotiations began. Defense attorneys weighed the strength of the evidence. Prosecutors considered the impact on witnesses and the community. Eventually, both defendants made a decision. They would not take this case to trial. Instead, each accepted plea agreements, admitting responsibility for their roles in what happened. Murder charges were reduced, but accountability remained. Prison sentences were inevitable. The courtroom would not be used to debate whether harm occurred. That question had already been answered. By the time this case reached the courtroom, there was no longer any debate about whether something terrible had happened. That question had already been answered. What remained was accountability. After months of investigation, interviews, and evidence review, prosecutors made their position clear. This was not a case they were willing to risk unraveling through technicalities or delays. The facts, they believed, were strong enough that the focus now shifted from what happened to how the justice system would respond. The first major development came when William made his decision. Rather than face a full trial, he accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for admitting responsibility to lesser charges, prosecutors agreed to drop the most severe count. It was not an act of mercy, it was a calculated resolution. William pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment. The sentence was significant, more than a decade behind bars. In court, there was no dramatic defense, no attempt to rewrite history. His plea acknowledged that his actions or lack of action played a role in what happened. The court made it clear that turning away, ignoring warning signs, and allowing harm to continue carried consequences just as real as direct violence. With one defendant sentenced, attention turned to Tamara. Her case carried a different weight. She was not just a caregiver, she was the legal parent, the person who had chosen to take responsibility for a child who could not protect himself. As her trial date approached, it became increasingly clear that prosecutors were prepared to present a devastating case. Witnesses were lined up, medical experts were ready, investigators were prepared to testify to what they had seen and documented. Facing that reality, Tamara also chose to plead guilty. She admitted to involuntary manslaughter and child abuse. The courtroom on the day of her sentencing was tense. Those involved in the case, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and others who had reviewed the evidence, sat quietly, many visibly affected. For them, this was not just another case file, it was one that stayed with you. Tamara was given the opportunity to speak. She did, but instead of fully accepting responsibility, her words drifted. She spoke about her own struggles, about being overwhelmed, about an abusive relationship, about circumstances that, in her view, explained how things had gone wrong. What she did not do, at least not in a way the court found convincing, was take ownership of the outcome. That mattered, because when the judge finally spoke, there was no ambiguity in his tone. He described the case as one of the most disturbing he had encountered in years on the bench. He rejected the idea that this was a tragic accident or an unavoidable failure. He spoke about choice, about duty, about what it means to accept responsibility for a child's life. And then he delivered words that would echo far beyond that courtroom. He said that what happened was not the act of a protector, but of someone who failed in the most fundamental way possible. He said that a parent's role is to safeguard, not to abandon, to intervene, not to look away, to act, not to explain after the fact. With that, he imposed the sentence. Tamara was ordered to spend decades in prison. Not a symbolic punishment, not a light sentence, but one that reflected the gravity of what the court believed had occurred. As the hearing ended, there was no sense of victory, only finality. 2 adults were now serving long prison sentences. A child was gone, and nothing the court could do would ever change that. What the legal system could do, what it did, was draw a line that said neglect can kill, that silence can be violence, and that responsibility does not disappear simply because something is hard. When the courtroom emptied and the doors closed, the case did not end. Legally, it was finished. Emotionally, it never will be. 2 adults were sentenced to long prison terms. A judge spoke plainly. Responsibility was assigned. The system did what it could within the limits of the law. But justice in cases like this never feels complete, because the person most affected never gets a voice. What remains is absence. A house that once held a child now holds silence. A routine that ended without warning. A life defined not by who he could have become, but by what he endured. And beyond the walls of that home, questions linger. Questions that reach far past one family and one courtroom. How does prolonged suffering happen without intervention? How does neglect hide behind explanations? How does a vulnerable child disappear from public view without alarms sounding sooner? This case forces a hard truth into focus. Cruelty does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it settles in slowly, disguised as stress, fatigue, or doing the best we can. Sometimes it thrives in isolation, where no one is watching closely enough to challenge what doesn't feel right. The warning signs were not dramatic. They were quiet. Missed routines, closed doors, excuses repeated until they sounded normal. In hindsight, each detail feels heavier, each missed opportunity sharper. But hindsight does not bring relief. It brings responsibility, because this wasn't a failure of one moment. It was a failure of accumulation, a failure to intervene early, a failure to question inconsistencies, a failure to act when care crossed the line into confinement. And while the adults involved are now paying the price through incarceration, the broader cost belongs to everyone who shares the duty to protect the most vulnerable among us. This case is not about perfection. It is about awareness, about recognizing that caregiving is not just presence, it is action, not just intent, but outcome. And when someone cannot advocate for themselves, silence should never be mistaken for peace. The courtroom words were harsh. They were meant to be, not as spectacle, but as acknowledgement. Because there are cases that demand clarity. Cases where euphemisms fail, where explanations collapse under evidence, where the truth must be stated plainly, no matter how uncomfortable it sounds. And this was one of them. What matters now is what happens next, outside the courtroom. Whether systems take warning signs more seriously, whether communities ask harder questions, whether silence is challenged before it becomes fatal. Because this story is not unique. It is only visible because it ended in tragedy, and the real measure of justice will not be how long the sentences were, but whether this outcome helps prevent another child from suffering unseen, unheard, and unprotected. That is what remains. Not closure, not comfort, but responsibility. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the truth deserves to be told clearly and without noise, like this video, share it so others don't look away, and subscribe for more real cases told with care, clarity, and respect.